Brother drowned in Lake Superior 11 years ago. At least that's what the Coast Guard told me when they handed me his wedding ring in a small plastic bag, still cold from the water they pulled it from. For 11 years I raised his 2 boys, paid off his mortgage with my own savings, sat through every parent-teacher conference, every football game, every Christmas where his chair stayed empty at the head of the table. Last month I flew to Vancouver for a contractors convention and saw him standing in line at a hotel coffee shop. Same crooked smile. Same scar above his left eyebrow from the time we crashed our bikes on Miller Road in 1978. He was holding the hand of a woman half my age and a little girl who looked just like our mother. Follow my story to the end and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I want to know how far this thing has traveled. My nav doesn't matter much, but for the sake of telling this straight, I'll just say I'm a 63-year-old structural engineer from a small town outside Duluth, Minnesota. My brother was Wendell. He was 4 years younger than me, the golden one, the charmer, the one our mother used to call her sunshine even when he was 38, and still couldn't keep a job longer than 2 years. The morning the lake took him was a Saturday in May. He'd gone out alone on his fishing boat, the one I co-signed the loan for after his second divorce. Storm came up fast, the way they do up there. And by sundown, the search and rescue boats were dragging the cold, deep stretch off Stockton Island. They found the boat capsized 2 days later. They never found him. Just the ring, his tackle box, and one work boot. His boys were 8 and 10. Their mother had been out of the picture since the older one was in diapers, off chasing some boyfriend down to Phoenix and sending birthday cards exactly when she remembered, which wasn't often. So when Wendell drowned, those kids looked at me with their father's eyes, and I made a promise I'd think about every single day for the next 11 years. I told them I'd never leave. I told them they'd never have to worry about who was going to show up for them. And then I kept that promise. The hard way, the only way I knew how, which was by giving up almost everything else I had. I sold my place in town and moved into his split level out by Cloquet. The mortgage was 3 years behind. Wendell had been hiding the foreclosure notices in the bottom of his sock drawer like a kid hiding a bad report card. I cashed out my 401k, paid off the back taxes, refinanced in my own name. My fiancée at the time, a woman named Margaret who I'd been engaged to for 2 years and who had been patiently waiting for me to set a date, came to the house one afternoon in October and told me she couldn't do this. She loved me, she said, but she hadn't signed up to be a stepmother to 2 grieving boys in a town she didn't want to live in. I didn't fight her on it. I think part of me was relieved. Trying to build a life with her on top of everything else felt like trying to build a second floor on a house with no foundation. The boys grew up. The older one, my nephew, he's a junior at the University of Minnesota now studying civil engineering. Going to follow in my footsteps, he tells everyone. And I won't lie, that sentence has done more to keep me alive than anything else in the last decade. The younger one had a harder time. He got into pills in 10th grade, did a stint at a place in Wisconsin, came out clean and angry, and eventually settled into a job at a small marina up in Bayfield, where he can work with his hands and not think too much. I helped pay for the rehab. I helped pay for both their tuitions. I drained the inheritance our mother had left for both her sons and put every penny of it toward them, because Wendell was gone and the boys were what he left behind and somebody had to do it. I want to be clear about something. I never resented those boys, not once. They are the closest thing I'll ever have to children of my own. And watching them grow up was the only good thing about those 11 years. What I resented, slowly, like rust eating through a steel beam, was the way my own life had quietly stopped existing. I worked. I cooked. I drove to hockey games and graduations and emergency room visits. I learned how to do taxes for 3 people. I learned how to talk to school counselors. I never traveled, never dated seriously, never read a book that wasn't about adolescent psychology or addiction recovery. By the time the younger one was 21 and the older one was at the university, I looked in the mirror one morning and realized I was an old man in a house that wasn't mine, sleeping in what used to be my brother's bedroom, surrounded by photographs of a family that was technically not my family at all. The Vancouver trip wasn't supposed to be anything special. It was a 4-day convention for structural engineers working on cold climate infrastructure, the kind of professional event I'd been skipping for a decade because I couldn't justify the expense or the time away. My boss, who's also one of my oldest friends, finally cornered me in his office in late September and told me he'd already booked the flight, already paid the registration, and if I didn't go, he was going to fire me out of spite. I think he could see what 11 years had done to me. I think everybody could see it but me, so I went. I packed a suitcase I hadn't used since 2013. I bought a new shirt because all my good ones were yellowed at the collar. I flew into Vancouver on a Monday morning with the strange sensation of being a tourist in my own life. The hotel was downtown, one of those tall glass buildings with a marble lobby and a coffee shop on the ground floor that opened onto a little plaza. I'd just come down for an espresso before the 8 o'clock keynote when I saw him. He was standing maybe 20 feet away, in line behind a businessman in a gray suit. He was wearing a dark blue jacket and good jeans and brown leather shoes, and his hair had gone almost completely silver, but the way he stood with one hand on his hip and his head tilted slightly to the right while he read the menu board, that was Wendell. That was my little brother. I've known that posture since he was 4 years old and waiting in line at the Dairy Queen on Highway 53 with our mother holding his other hand. I didn't move. People moved around me. Someone bumped my shoulder and apologized in French. I just stood there in the middle of that lobby with my conference badge clipped to my lapel and watched him pay for 2 drinks, a black coffee for himself and what looked like a hot chocolate, and then turn and walk toward a small woman with dark hair who was waiting at a window table with a child. The child was a girl, maybe 6 years old, with curly brown hair and a face that I cannot describe except to say it was the face of our mother when she was a young woman, a face I had only seen in the photographs that used to sit on the mantel in the house in Duluth. He sat down next to the woman. He kissed her temple. The little girl climbed into his lap, and he made a face at her that I had seen him make 100 times when we were boys, this exaggerated frown that always made our mother laugh. The girl laughed. The woman laughed. My brother, who had been dead for 11 years, who I had buried in absentia in a Catholic cemetery in Duluth with a stone that cost me $3,000, sat across the room from me and laughed at his own joke with his hand resting on the small of his wife's back. I went up to my hotel room, and I sat on the edge of the bed and I didn't move for about 45 minutes. I missed the keynote. I missed the first 3 sessions of the day. When I finally stood up, I went straight back down to the coffee shop, but of course they were gone. I asked the barista, a young guy with a nose ring, whether he recognized them. He said the man and woman came in most mornings, that they lived in one of the apartment buildings 2 blocks over, but he didn't know exactly which one. I tipped him $40 and went out into the street. That afternoon, I did something I'd never done in my life. I walked into a private investigator's office. There was one not far from the convention center, and a small brick building wedged between a Thai restaurant and a notary public. The man behind the desk was about my age, ex-RCMP, soft-spoken, and he didn't blink when I told him my story. He took the photograph I'd snapped surreptitiously from my hotel window and they walked past on the sidewalk. He took my deposit, 2,000 Canadian dollars, which felt like a fortune but turned out to be a bargain. He called me 36 hours later. The man in the photograph, he said, lived under the name Edmund Wellesley. Canadian citizen, naturalized 8 years ago, married to a woman named Annika, originally from Estonia, who worked as a translator for a Vancouver shipping firm. They had one daughter, 6 years old, and they lived in a townhouse on Pendrell Street. Edmund Wellesley owned a small marine consulting business that worked with insurance companies on freshwater shipwreck claims. He built the business from nothing, starting about 10 years ago. His paper trail before that was thin, the investigator said. Suspiciously thin. The kind of thin that usually means somebody bought their identity from a guy in a warehouse in Toronto. I want to tell you what that information did to me, but I'm not sure I have the words. Wendell wasn't just alive. He had built a life. He had a wife. He had a wife. He had a daughter he had actually managed to keep, when his 2 sons by his first marriage had spent the last 11 years thinking their father was at the bottom of a lake. He had a business consulting on the exact kind of accident he had faked his way out of. The cruelty of that, the sheer mathematical precision of it, was something I had to sit with for a long time before I could function. I stayed in Vancouver for 2 more days after the convention ended. I didn't tell anyone back home. I walked past their townhouse twice, on opposite sides of the street, with a baseball cap pulled low. The 3rd time I saw him was on a Thursday afternoon. He was walking the little girl home from what must have been a dance class because she was carrying a pink bag and wearing leggings, and he was carrying her jacket over his arm and pretending to be too tired to keep up with her. She kept turning around to wait for him. He kept stumbling theatrically. She laughed every time. I stood across the street next to a bus shelter, and I watched my brother be the father he had never been to his own sons, and something inside me broke that I'm not sure has ever knit itself back together. I went home. I didn't confront him. I didn't know how to confront him. I told my boss the convention had been useful, which it hadn't been at all because I had attended exactly one breakfast event, and I went back to work and tried to sleep and mostly didn't. I lay awake thinking about the boys, about what this meant, about whether I had the right to take this knowledge and detonate it in their lives the way it had been detonated in mine. The thing that finally pushed me over the edge happened about 3 weeks after I got back. My older nephew called me from campus, upset, asking if I could help him out with rent. His landlord had raised it, and he was working 2 jobs already, and he didn't want to drop out, but he didn't see how he was going to make November. I told him not to worry. I told him I'd cover it. I hung up the phone, walked into the kitchen, and threw a coffee mug at the wall so hard it left a divot in the drywall. 11 years. 11 years of robbing Peter to pay Paul to give those boys a stable life. And their father, my brother, was paying for ballet lessons in Vancouver with money he was earning by consulting on insurance fraud. I sat down at the kitchen table and I made a decision. I hired a lawyer first, a woman in Minneapolis who specialized in fraud and probate, recommended to me by a friend who had been through a nasty estate dispute. I sat across from her in a glass-walled conference room on a Monday morning, and I told her the whole story from beginning to end. She didn't interrupt. She took notes in a yellow legal pad with a fountain pen. When I was done, she set down the pen and she looked at me and she said 3 things that I have not forgotten. She said, "Your brother committed insurance fraud, abandoned his children, and faked his death to escape his obligations, and the statute of limitations on most of that has run out, but not on all of it." She said, "The boys, as his legal heirs, have standing for civil claims he could not easily defend against in any jurisdiction." And she said, "If we do this right, you will not get the 11 years back, but you will get something that looks like justice, and more importantly, you will get the truth on the table where it belongs." I cried in her office. I am 63 years old, and I have not cried in front of another human being since my mother's funeral in 2004. And I sat in that conference room and cried like a child for about 10 minutes while she handed me tissues and waited. Then we got to work. The first thing we did was nothing. For 2 months we did nothing while she quietly built a file. The investigator in Vancouver kept tabs. We pulled together every record we could find from the original death claim, the Coast Guard report, the insurance payout that I had used to pay off the mortgage and bury him with. There had been a payout almost $300,000 from a policy he had taken out exactly 14 months before he disappeared. That number had always sat funny with me, but 11 years ago I was too crushed by grief to ask the questions I should have asked. The lawyer asked them. She found the timeline. She found the boat loan I had co-signed. She found the second mortgage he had taken out on the house 90 days before the storm, money that had been wired to a Bahamian account and from there had simply evaporated. While she built the file, I went to Wisconsin to see my younger nephew. I drove up on a Saturday in early November, when the trees along the lake were already bare and the wind off Superior cut through the windbreaker I was wearing. I took him out to a diner in Washburn where we used to eat breakfast when he was a kid, and over pancakes and bad coffee I told him. I told him everything. I told him I had seen his father in Vancouver, that his father was alive, that his father had a new wife and a new daughter, that his father had stolen money from a life insurance policy and from the equity in their house, and had walked out on him and his brother 11 years ago by his own choice. I told him I was so sorry. I told him I had thought about whether to even tell him, and I had decided that he was a grown man and he deserved the truth. He didn't say anything for a long time. He looked out the window at a Ford pickup truck in the parking lot. Then he stood up, walked outside, and I watched him through the glass as he punched the side of a dumpster 3 times with his bare fist. He came back in with his knuckles bleeding, sat down, and ate the rest of his pancakes without a word. When he finally spoke, he said, "I always knew. I didn't know what I knew, but I knew something. And I want you to do whatever you can do, Uncle. I want him to know what he did." I told the older one a week later, over the phone, because he was in the middle of finals, and I wasn't going to wait until Christmas to tell him something like this. He took it differently. He went quiet, asked careful, lawyer-like questions, and at the end he said, "I want to meet him. I don't want to confront him yet. I just want to see him with my own eyes." So I flew him to Vancouver over his winter break. I rented us a small apartment 2 blocks from his father's townhouse. For 4 days, we walked the neighborhood together, two strangers in baseball caps, and on the third afternoon, we sat on a bench in a small park while Wendell pushed his daughter on a swing. My nephew watched his father for about 20 minutes without speaking. Then he turned to me and he said, "He looks happy, doesn't he?" I said, "Yes, he does." And my nephew, this kid I had raised from age 10, looked at me with eyes that were dry and very tired and said, "Good. Now let's take it apart." What happened next took 14 months. I won't pretend it was clean or quick. The lawyer worked it on multiple fronts. The insurance company that had paid out the original $300,000 was notified through a confidential disclosure. They moved fast once they had evidence, because the amount they could potentially recover plus the precedent of the case was worth far more than the cost of pursuing it. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police got involved on the identity fraud question, working in coordination with U.S. authorities. Interpol was eventually pulled in because some of the original wire transfers had touched accounts in 3 different countries. Through all of it, Wendell didn't know. We made the decision early to let everything land at once. He was still going to the coffee shop every morning. He was still walking his daughter home from dance class on Thursdays. He had no idea that the file on him was growing thicker by the week, or that his older son, the boy he had abandoned when the kid was 10, was the one who had sat in the lawyer's office helping line up the witnesses. The arrest happened on a Tuesday morning in March, 14 months after I first saw him in the coffee shop. He was picked up by RCMP officers outside his townhouse, on the sidewalk where he had pretended to stumble for his daughter. The wife and child were not present. The lawyer had specifically requested that, and the RCMP had honored it. He was charged in Canada with identity fraud and immigration fraud. The U.S. charges, including insurance fraud and abandonment, were lined up to follow extradition. I was in Minneapolis when she called to tell me it had happened. I was in a Target buying socks. I remember that very clearly because I stood in the sock aisle holding my phone and listening to her describe the morning's events, and a woman with a toddler in a shopping cart asked me politely to move because I was blocking the cheaper brand. I moved. I thanked the lawyer. I hung up. I bought the socks. Then I went out to my truck and I sat in the parking lot for an hour and a half staring at nothing. The civil suit on behalf of the boys settled out of court 6 months after his conviction. I won't share the exact amount, but I will tell you it was enough that my older nephew finished his engineering degree without working 2 jobs, and my younger nephew was able to put a down payment on a small house in Bayfield, with a workshop in the back where he restores wooden boats now. There is also enough left over that they will both have something to start their adult lives with that does not come from me draining what was left of mine. The wife in Vancouver, Annika, was not charged with anything. The investigation determined she had been deceived just as thoroughly as the rest of us. The lawyer arranged for me to meet with her once in a coffee shop in Vancouver, 6 weeks after the arrest. She is a quiet, dignified woman who speaks 4 languages and was, I think, the only true thing in Wendell's second life. She thanked me for not contacting her directly before the arrest. She told me her daughter knew her father was in some kind of trouble but not the shape of it yet. She asked me if I would be willing someday, when the little girl was older, to tell her about her grandmother and her 2 half-brothers and the small town in Minnesota where her family was from. I said yes, I would be honored. That little girl is my niece. I'm still figuring out what that means, but I sent her a card on her birthday, and I have a small savings account in her name that I add to every month, and her mother and I talk on the phone sometimes about practical things. She is a real person, and Wendell didn't get to ruin her too. Wendell is currently in a Canadian federal facility serving a sentence that, with the extradition and the U.S. charges, will likely keep him locked up until he is in his mid-70s. I have not visited him. The older nephew went once. He has not told me what was said in that room, and I have not asked. The younger nephew has not gone and has said he will not. I respect that. People ask me sometimes if I forgive him. I don't think forgiveness is the right word. What I have done is set the weight down. For 11 years, I carried a story about my brother that turned out to be a lie, and I let that story shape every decision I made, including the ones that cost me a marriage and my own retirement savings, and the small private life I might have built for myself. When I found out the truth, I had a choice. I could carry the new story the same way I had carried the old one, letting it crush me from a different angle. Or I could set it down, take care of what needed taking care of, and try to find out who I was supposed to be in whatever years I have left. I sold the house in Cloquet last spring. The boys had both moved out and there was no reason to keep that much square footage for one old bachelor. I bought a small cabin on the North Shore. 2 bedrooms and a wood stove, with a view of the lake that took my brother and didn't actually take him at all. I see both my nephews regularly. The older one is engaged now to a young woman in St. Paul who has been kind to me from the first day I met her. The younger one is doing well, sober 8 years next month, and he has a steady girlfriend who works at the same marina. There is a woman who lives down the road from me. Her name is not important for the story, but I will say that her husband died of cancer 4 years ago, and she keeps chickens, and she makes the best sourdough bread I have ever tasted in my life. We have dinner together 2 or 3 times a week. We are not engaged. We are not in any hurry. At 63, I have learned that some things do not need to be rushed, and some things do not need to be named. If you are still listening, I want to leave you with one thing. For 11 years, I believed my brother was a tragedy. He turned out to be a choice, and the difference between those two things matters more than I can explain. A tragedy you carry. A choice somebody else made. You are allowed to put down. You are allowed to walk away from it. You are allowed to build a life on the other side of it. It took me a year of confrontation and lawyers and police reports to learn that lesson, but I learned it, and I am telling you now in case you need to hear it. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from. I read everyone. My brother stole 11 years from me and from his sons, but he doesn't get the rest of them, and he doesn't get to take this story either. This story is mine now, and it ends the way I say it ends. I've spent a lot of nights on the porch of this little cabin since the trial ended, watching the lake do what lakes do, and I've thought a lot about how I got here. The thing I keep coming back to is that nothing in my life happened by accident. Every step of the last 11 years was somebody's choice. Wendell chose to take out that insurance policy 14 months before the storm. He chose to wire the money to the Bahamas. He chose to climb off that boat and walk away from 2 little boys who needed him. And then he chose every single morning for 11 years to keep walking. Cause and effect, that's all this ever was. He planted what he planted, and eventually it grew up around him in a Vancouver courtroom. But I made choices too, and I don't get to pretend I didn't. I chose to swallow my grief without asking the hard questions when the numbers on that policy didn't add up. I chose to let Margaret walk out the door without fighting for her. I chose to drain my retirement instead of asking the boy's mother to do her share, because I told myself it was easier. Some of those choices were the right ones. Some of them weren't. The honest part of getting older is admitting you don't always know which is which until 20 years go by. What I want my nephews to take from this, and what I'd want anyone listening to take from this, is that doing the right thing is not the same as doing the easy thing or the quiet thing. For 11 years, I did the right thing, the quiet way. I paid the bills and I showed up at the hockey games, and I never asked the questions I should have been asking. That kind of decency is real, but it isn't enough on its own. You have to pair it with your eyes open. You have to be willing to look at what's actually in front of you, even when looking costs you something. The other thing I'd say is this. When the truth finally landed in my lap in that hotel coffee shop in Vancouver, I had every reason in the world to fall apart. A weaker version of me would have. The version of me from 20 years ago might have. But somewhere in those 11 years of raising 2 boys who weren't mine, I had built up something I didn't even know I had, which is the kind of stubbornness that lets a person keep walking forward when the ground gives out underneath them. I called the lawyer. I told the boys. I did the work. Grit isn't loud. Grit is just the thing that gets you out of the hotel bed and back down to the street. Wendell is going to sit in a cell until he's an old man, and I'm going to sit on this porch and listen to the loons. And somewhere in Vancouver, a little girl is going to grow up knowing she has an uncle in Minnesota who didn't disappear on her. That is the math. You reap what you plant. Plant carefully.